Episode 6 Star Trek Picard Review. Hi, my name is Rick. Let's get going and beware spoilers ahead. A lot comes to a head in this episode. Picard and Soji meet, Hugh gets involved, Narek is revealed, and they escape the artifact. Narek actually was the most engaging in this episode that I've seen him, and I was happily surprised to see that he commits to killing Soji after learning what he needed. I was worried that this was going to become a redemption story, but nicely subverted. He all but confesses that he is falling in love with Soji, but his commitment to the Tal Shiar's Zhat-Vash trumps all, and although pained, he goes through with his plans. This makes him a more complex villain, but still a villain, and I loved it. I also liked Jurati's naive speculation that the Borg may have changed into a less aggressive culture, and was completely with Picard when he countered that they don't change, they metastasize. Of course, he got a little angrier than a younger Picard would have, but I'm putting this down to the potential brain issues that has been quietly brewing since the end of TNG. I don't usually make particular note of the camera work, instead focusing on the story, lore and characters, but this episode I noted two things that really stood out to me in a positive way. The first was Picard's research of the Borg, leading him to the overlay of Locutus. And they've played with that shot before, but here it was way more meaningful. The second shot was of Soji attempting to talk to her mother, and how everything began to tilt as she realised that her life was being upended. When Picard was about to board the Borg Cube, he states that the last time he was on one was when he was Locutus, and I had to take a minute to rethink, and yeah, his only time on a Borg Cube was during his assimilation. But I'll save that for the lore breakdown at the end. The notion of Picard beaming into the cube alone to an unknown section of it added to the sense of unease, and I wouldn't have put it past some vindictive Romulan to have recognised the name and deliberately done that to screw with him. The atmosphere, spliced with the old footage of his Borg encounters, made it super clear that he would rather have been anywhere else. But I thought the near panic attack was a little too much. Then again, there's no getting around it. Picard, the character, is 94 years old by now and evidently feeling his vulnerability. It's amazing how much lighting can overhaul a scene. The white lights that are throughout the cube, replacing the hazy greens and dull oranges of prior Trek, do subtract their menace somewhat. And I was hoping that this episode would do more to reinstate the Borg as a more terrifying presence. But it kinda does the opposite, at least as far as the XBs are concerned. Hugh's reintroduction was everything I'd hoped for, with him immediately identifying Picard and offering a steadying, safe presence in a cosmic karma of some form for everything the Enterprise crew did for him. I wonder if he's been in communication with Geordi at all. You know, being a Federation citizen, he admits his position on the artifact is far more secured, respected and stable than the other recovered drones. I always thought the terms the artifact and XBs were a little un-Trekish, but Hugh explains that their dedication to using such terms is to help the recovering Borg identify themselves as separate from the collective, which is a nice touch, and I feel something that Hugh would definitely do, now that I'm presented with that argument. Although this scene should have played out before Picard asserts that Soji is in danger, as it derails the pace they'd set up slightly. With the other characters, let's start with Jurati. Well, the minute the EMH reactivates, there should be hell to pay. Then again, we never got an explanation of the debris in Rios' shoulder when we first met him, so maybe this will be another plot element lost to the cutting room floor. If only they'd all had the runtime closer to this episode. Secondly, when she comes onto Rios, well, I literally jotted down my reactions. Okay. What? Ah, okay. She's a mess right now. Oh no. No, bad decision. There we go. To be fair to Rios, he has no idea of what went down exactly and how close her and Maddox were, but Agnes really is a mental mess, it seems. We then get to see Rios' interactions with Raffi, who has returned to being her slumming self in despair, which makes me sad, but it's a quiet scene that paints the two as almost friends, not just colleagues. Lore-wise, we learn that the Romulans have a public and a private name, which is fine, that doesn't really change much, and they have a meditative ritual that they occasionally practice, which we've never heard from before, but being cousins to the Vulcans, I mean, there is a precedent. I also want to point out the spatial trajector inside the Queen's chamber on the Cube. So we also learn from Hugh that many memories input into the drones during assimilation remain, something alluded to when Picard commanded the fleet to destroy the Cube in the Battle of Sector 001 in First Contact. So, the trajector was a device created by the Sicarians, a race from the Delta Quadrant encountered by Voyager in 2371. I have a video on the device which I'll plop a link into here, but the troubling implication is that the Borg have continued to metastasize post-Voyager, so Janeway's virus did not cripple them permanently. One more little nitpick. It seems that Elnor had more than enough time to jump through the trajector. But then, in hindsight, Hugh does mention that the device needs to power down over the next couple of minutes, and I suspect that the Romulans do not know of the advanced device within the Cube's core, so holding them off can be rationalised as a smart move to protect Picard and Soji's escape. However, Elnor did not know this when he volunteered to stay behind, but Star Trek is hardly alone in taking time to say goodbye during a supposed time limit. I also hope he's not dead. My inner 11-year-old would hate to see the loss of the samurai space elf warrior monk. Overall, this episode did a good amount of interrelationship building with the crew of the La Sirena, and I was happy to see Hugh's introduction, and it paints a clear line between the XBs and the drones of the collective, one which Picard needed to see. I also did overhear one of the XBs call out Locutus when he ran past. I like the direction that the characters are headed for the most part, and Hugh was a much needed respite from the grim tone of the prior episode. The irony that the inside of a Borg Cube is actually more of a sanctuary than the outside galaxy at the moment. So, now onto the lore, and I'm going to look through Picard's interactions with the Borg. Q did it. Kind of. Well, to be honest, the Borg were beginning to encroach on Federation and Romulan territory in the episode Neutral Zone, but we never saw them, only the disappearance of several UFP and Romulan colony worlds. At this stage, each side blamed the other, unaware of the approaching danger, and the Enterprise entered a standoff against two Deredex warbirds. Then, to teach humanity a lesson, the powerful entity known as Q flung the USS Enterprise D across the galaxy to land in Borg space in 2365. He did so to challenge Picard's arrogant assertion that humanity was ready for anything, by introducing them to a power that could not be reasoned with, bargained, or dissuaded from their goal. After attempting the Starfleet personable approach, they ended up fleeing from the Cube, and Picard is forced to ask Q for help in escaping, which he complies with. The encounter served to motivate Starfleet Tactical to begin its own anti-Borg project headed by Commander Shelby. However, they were still woefully underprepared for the first conflict a year later. New Providence Colony vanished, and investigations revealed the Borg to be behind it. Attempting to track down the roaming Cube, the USS Enterprise eventually engages the target with Shelby's advice, helping somewhat. However, things did not go well, and several drones beam onto the bridge, capturing Captain Picard, taking him back to the Cube and assimilating him into the collective. He was to be an avatar of the Borg, known as Locutus, in an attempt to convince and demoralise Starfleet into less resistance against the Borg. It is also retconned in later that the Queen Borg herself was also curious about Picard and took this experimental approach partly to create an equal. This led to the Massacre of Wolf 359, where 39 of the 40 starships the Federation sent to intercept the Cube were destroyed, including the Saratoga, Benjamin Sisko's vessel. Eventually, acting Captain Riker led a rescue mission to retrieve Picard, and once disconnected, Picard was able to pass on the command for the Borg to enter the regeneration mode. This shut down the cube long enough for it to be destroyed, but on being asked how much of the experience Picard remembered, he replied he was conscious for all of it. For the first time in years, Picard returns home to the family vineyard to meet with his brother Robert, and the two reconcile over issues while Picard breaks down over his experiences in the collective in the arms of his brother. This goes a long way to healing the trauma of being used to murder 11,000 of his fellow officers. In 2368, a crashed Borg scout ship is recovered and a single drone is rescued. Picard decides that they can create a virus that would spread throughout the collective and damage or destroy a good number of drones. However, the rescued Borg, now disconnected from the collective, is recovering its identity and even naming itself Hugh. Picard has been avoiding meeting with Hugh in order to quash any moral qualms, but realises that Hugh cannot be sacrificed when he finally talks to the former drone. Hugh gives himself up to the collective anyway to protect the Enterprise from the Borg's retrieval ship. However, his individuality remains intact and even spreads into the other drones on that vessel. That vessel was then severed from the collective and drifted until found by Lore, Data's brother, and he recruited the confused and individualized drones as an army because Lore is a dick. Eventually, Data overthrows Lore and frees Hugh and the rest of the drones. Hugh goes on to receive Federation citizenship at a later point, presumably returning to the Federation space and continuing his growth as an individual. In 2369, Picard had to meet with Commander Benjamin Sisko and assign him to Deep Space Nine. The meeting was laced with tension, as both knew Picard was not really to blame for Wolf 359, but nonetheless it was the face of Jean-Luc Picard plastered all over the view screens of the ill-fated fleet. The last encounter Picard had with the Borg was in 2373. Amid rumours of their sightings in the Alpha Quadrant, Picard began to have nightmares of his assimilation, and the newly commissioned Enterprise E was asked not to intervene in the coming conflict. Instead, he decided to join the defence of Sector 001, and using his latent memories of the collective, he commands the fleet and successfully destroys the cube. However, it launches a sphere capable of time travel at Earth, and the Enterprise follows it through to 2063, a few days before humanity's first contact with the Vulcans. During this mission, the captain re-encounters the Borg Queen, and the Enterprise is partly assimilated. During the struggle, he comes to the realization that he is being driven by revenge and is troubled by this revelation. On the plus side, after the Romulan supernova, Hugh seems to have reached out to the Romulan Free State and attained permission to work on the Borg Reclamation Project as its director on behalf of the Federation, where we now see him returning individuality to a severed cube in Romulan space. So, the Borg have always been a weak point for Picard. In the time of TNG, we saw him grieve, face repercussions from Starfleet in both Sisko and the reluctance to assign him any Borg-related missions, and then his own issues of repressed anger. This is why I find it completely in character that Picard would have some deliberation about returning to any cube, considering the only time he ever boarded one in the past was when he was being violated by the Borg. Doing so as an elderly man took great resolve, and despite his momentary freak-out, I found the general reaction to be understandable. Anyway, that about covers it for my breakdown and review of the Impossible Box episode of Star Trek Picard, and I hope you'll check out this timeline video I made based on the Last Best Hope novel that recently came out too. So until the next video, thanks again for watching. I've been Rick, and I'll see you again later. Goodbyes.